Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Raise podcast, where we get under the hood of founder scaling stories. And we're very fortunate today. Will and I have got Matthew Simmonds with us, who is co-founder and managing director of Entocycle. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Oh, thanks very much. Great to be here.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So let's get straight into it. And I guess the sensible place to start would be, what do Entocycle actually do?
Yeah, so I've just finished an 8-year stint at Entocycle. So Entocycle is an insect technology company. We take food waste, which is a massive societal problem. Over 1 billion tons of food are wasted every year.
1 billion?
8% of greenhouse gas emissions globally is from food waste. So we can take that and we can create a sustainable protein using insects. And so there's this fascinating juxtaposition of biology and technology in order to be able to process food waste scale and turn that into a really efficient form of protein. And then the protein on the other side of the coin is a substitute for things like fish meal and soy. Fish meal and soy are both really bad for the environment. So soy is associated with chopping down the rainforest. We chop down the rainforest at 1.5 acres a second to put things like soy plantations down. And fish meal, since 1970, half the fish in the world's oceans have disappeared. And that is just through overfishing. And so we dredge the world's oceans of things like pelagic fish in South America, grind that up into a paste, and then put that into our salmon farms in Scotland. And so it's like a wholly unsustainable ecosystem. And what we can do is we can locally take food waste and we can create a sustainable source of protein using our insects.
Technical stuff, I imagine. What's the sort of scale? I mean, it's quite clear the problem you were trying to solve, but what are we talking about? If you're about an insect farm, what sort of scale are we talking to achieve this?
So ranges from anything from, in the industry, you have these sort of small backyard sort of chicken farming sort of operations through to some really big industrial scale solutions. So we would operate anywhere from something like 10 tons input per day through to we're working on a plant up to 400 tons of food waste processed every day.
Good stuff.
Excellent. We're really keen to understand what the company looked like in the early days, Matt. You mentioned you've done an 8-year stint, and I'm sure it changed quite significantly across that time cycle. So take us back to the early days and what it looked like.
Yeah, it changed a huge amount during that time, and I think that was quite a fascinating part of the journey. So when I joined, it was a sort of very small group of people. It was Kieran, our founder, like crazy guy with a crazy dream, and we kind of met and he said, I want to build these fully automated insect factories. Had raised a little bit of cash from sort of grant funding. I think we had about 50K in the bank at that stage. And there were kind of a couple of people working for the company. Very sort of flat structure, very open-ended in terms of what everyone's roles were. Everyone kind of chipped in and sort of did various different bits over time. And then over time, that obviously transformed into a much more mature structure where we had, kind of a clear set of role definitions. We had a team of about 30 people, and we had a commercial sector, we had a technology division. It was a sort of a much bigger kind of more mature ecosystem. And I think part of my role in Entocycle was actually managing that transition over time and knowing what gear we needed to be in over time. Because it's from the early stage, that early stage thinking is very different to that later stage thinking. And you as a founder has to constantly be switching gears to know how to think and sort of manage that transition.
Okay. Remember what I asked now. So how did you find that transition then from as your role changed throughout the business, you had to sort of evolve with the business almost?
Yeah, I think as a sort of founding member of the company, you have to constantly be thinking, what kind of stage are we at? And therefore, what type of thinking do we need to employ throughout each one of those different stages? Like, I think the early days, it was much more about a very small group of people, very kind of intimate relationship. Everyone knew each other really, really well, got on really well. It was a very flat structure, and it was about moving as quick as you possibly could and developing as quickly as you possibly could. As you then start to grow and mature out, I think particularly sort of post Series A, that sort of structure inevitably has to come into place. So you need a hierarchy to be able to actually manage a team over a certain size. You need clear communication channels. You need different departments. You need processes to be able to manage budgets, to be able to set targets. And it becomes a much more sort of formalized structure. That would never have worked in the early days. I think people would have just got sort of fed up with the bureaucracy of it, myself included. But at some point, you need to be able to make sure that all that is in place to basically keep people working happily and effectively. And that is quite a transition.
Well, you're muted.
And when did you actually find that scaling got harder than you expected? Were any particular stages of the business journey, or were there any particular verticals and areas that you found hard to hire for?
I think it was a sort of marked transition when we closed our Series A round. So I think there was sort of a Entocycle pre and post Series A. There was quite a transition there. So actually my role changed as well during that time. So I was previously CTO of the business, and then post Series A stepped up to the managing director role. There was a sort of order of magnitude more funds in the business post Series A than there was before. There were many more investors. You've got to set up a board. You've got to set up kind of clearer investor communications across, multiple investors. You're a sort of different beast altogether. There's a sort of governance and a sort of management that was never required before. And I think that really changed sort of post Series A. Was also a whole scaling in terms of the team as well, putting in clear hiring plans, actually onboarding processes, all that stuff actually starts to matter when you get to a certain size. And I think that's something that kind of in sort of post Series A.
Did you, out of interest, it sort of sounds to me like you went from startup to scale up at that point, but would you class yourselves as a scale up in terms of the volume of hiring or people that you had? It sounds like from a business, it was quite mature quite quickly from my personal experience and people and other founders that we speak to, but it'd be interesting to get your sort of thoughts.
Yeah, I think probably that marked the transition to scale up. It also marked the transition to fully focusing on commercialization of the business. We were quite an unusual company in many senses. What we were doing was incredibly difficult, incredibly complicated. We weren't sort of just designing not to trivialize it, but this wasn't sort of an app to deliver something. This was an entire end-to-end factory process. They were responsible from everything throughout that entire process. There was physical hardware involved. There was software. There were various different sort of teams. There was biology at play. So we had a team of entomologists. We had a team of mechanical engineers, process engineers, controls and automations engineers. It was a hugely sort of technical thing to get organized and work together as this coherent unit. And there was no sort of blueprint for an insect factory. So from first principles, we were figuring this stuff out. It was literally like, back in the day when Henry Ford and Daimler and etc. were sort of inventing the motor car, and you see all these sort of crazy motor cars with entirely different. Some had 3 wheels, some had 4 wheels, some had they kind of they all look like bonkers different, because that's the kind of stage the industry was at. And so to actually sort of develop technology in that kind of environment meant that, you were trying wildly different concepts, and this sort of thing that was an insect factory looked vastly different from day one to sort of year 8. And so I think that was that technology journey up to Series A. We were incredibly technically focused, and it was less about how do we commercialize this. It's about technically what should an insect factory look like, and we need to define that blueprint. Post Series A, it was okay, now we've got this technology, how do we then commercialize that technology? So that was an entirely different sort of prospect altogether, which is a very different play to sort of other businesses I've worked with in the past, which is, sort of much more sort of lean startup approach, very much sort of commercial, etc. You couldn't really do that in our industry. It had to be, what does this thing look like? We've actually got to do sort of tech first and then commercial later.
Yeah. And are you always, even though you've got to sort of commercialization, are you always still sort of really digging into that technology in terms of where are the gains? It's not the finished article. It's never the finished article, I guess. So how much of it is we're still developing versus commercialization? And that's a hard mix to get right, I imagine.
That was one of the hardest challenges that we had. And I think, so like to give you context, we tracked from a technical perspective, something like, it was well over 100 parameters, from like growth rates, survival rates, temperatures, humidity, all sorts of gases. You've got robotic arms, you've got sort of sensors, conveyor belts, you've got like a machine vision, like counter that can count near, and it's all this kind of technology suite. And every single one of those had a process flow. So we'd be tracking the sort of physical movement of food waste in to product out.
Yeah.
And there was a sort of an engineering flow of that. There's a mass flow process there, and that drove the commercial model, right? So it's like, how much stuff do you get in versus how much stuff do you get out? What's the quality of the stuff that's out, and therefore what can you sell? And so even before you can get to a point where you can build a business model, you need a really, really good understanding of all of those different processes throughout that kind of cycle. Then you can build a business model off the back of it. So then you had a commercial business model off the back of it, which then also was quite a complex thing, because you're looking at a sort of 20-25 year factory life cycle, and there's a whole bunch of fluctuations in that. So you're tracking all these different parameters, and you're trying to simultaneously look at where the market's going. You're commercializing the business. You're trying to understand, where is this going from a commercial perspective? Where are our customers? What do they actually need? What kind of size of facility? What kind of budget do they have? What are their constraints? And you're feeding that information back through to this sort of technical roadmap. And so you're trying to build for the right customers, but at the same time, you've got this sort of push the other way, where it's what is technically possible. What can we do now to be able to deliver a product to these customers? And so this is sort of a constant sort of mapping of these two sort of forces across the business, which could become a really contentious, difficult process, right? Where if that's done badly, the technical team, the commercial team are just at loggerheads, because they've both got different sort of incentives. And I think we work really hard to try and sort of remove that and get sort of both sides of those, that we saw as a healthy tension in the business. And we'd be sitting down every week and sharing, here's the intelligence from the market, this is what I need from a commercial perspective, versus here's where we are on a technical side, here's all the risks that we're managing here, here's all of the sort of the breakthroughs that we're hoping to have over this time, and we're going to keep you abreast of this. And it was a kind of sort of building these two pillars of the business at the same time. And yeah, sort of sitting in the middle of those two was a tricky thing to do, but I think we got there.
That's well done. Lots of things that can go wrong. I think Will had actually. I think Will sort of mentioned he was going to ask you an interesting question around that, to be fair.
Yeah, so the company that I'm working with at the moment, sort of similar early stage engineering, and the sort of, like you said, constant iteration and juxtaposition between the engineering team wanting to put out their best product versus commercially it being almost like just good enough engineering, and still being able to ship something ultimately. Did you have any sort of moments, I think contractually, where, and I don't know how your contracts work, but did you have any moments contractually where you had to, or you'd agreed to certain parameters, certain guarantees of productivity, operational hours, etc., where you then had a real world implication of that internal struggle?
Yeah, I mean, that was a big risk for us as a company. As factory sizes increased, that risk increased dramatically to a point where it could just bankrupt the business. So that was something that, like, if you build a big factory and you've committed to a certain yield or throughput, then and you can't deliver that, that's it. You are stuck. So yeah, that was something we were always very, very careful of. And again, it was about, there would be many conversations between the sort of commercial side and the technical side. Look, my customer wants guarantees on throughput and yield. They're asking for this, that, and the other. Well, okay, here's all the risks associated with that. And actually some of that stuff was outside of our control. So I think that was one thing that was really important. You can only sort of guarantee the things that you're fully in control of. What we did was we produced technology and handed that over to an operator. That operator was then responsible for operating that correctly. And there are a whole bunch of parameters with the feedstock that came in, the temperatures that they operated at, the processes need to be done correctly. So we were really sort of careful on what we would commit to from that kind of perspective. And yet, largely, I think we got that. There were a couple of times where we committed to deliver stuff and it just took longer and cost more than we sort of anticipated. And in those cases, you've just got to dig deep and sort of ride the costs out. And we did that a couple of times, but largely, I think we kind of were very careful, and I think probably made the right decisions on that stuff.
It's just so many things that can go wrong, isn't there? There's too many.
Tough.
I mean, there's a graveyard of companies out there, EPC companies, that sort of overcommitted to things and then end up in litigation, and that's the end of the company. I think proceeding with an element of caution is probably always the wise step forward to start with.
What I would say as well is, because this was an entirely new industry, there were no industry standards, no industry norms. It was kind of like the Wild West in a way, right? So if you went for a tender, your customer would vary dramatically from, it could be a really mature, kind of operational company, through to an entrepreneur with, who's raised a bunch of cash. They operate in an entirely different way, an entirely different risk profile and expectations, etc. And then if they throw out a tender, or if they're in talks with a number of different customers, if you come along and say, look, this is how a sort of typically a factory is delivered, here's the processes that you go through, like this is how we go through the stage of sort of scoping out your factory, taking risk out of that factory, and essentially sort of building from this sort of feasibility concept stage through to a front-end engineering design report, through to detailed engineering, through to then you commit to all these different contracts. There are these sort of stages that you would go through, and you lay that out, and there are costs associated with every single one of those stages, but that's how you build a factory. In that world where, in the insect environment, like there's not that many factories that exist, someone else could come along and go, sure, we'll build you a factory. It'll cost you 5 million quid and we'll deliver this. And they look infinitely more attractive, right? Because they've kind of just simplified the whole process. But the reality is that that's a terrible way of operating. That will never ever work, and they'll never be able to come good. They'll never be able to guarantee those sort of elements of the design. But it actually becomes quite hard to compete with that because there isn't that sort of, there also wasn't that graveyard of companies that had failed through kind of being slightly cowboyish. So it was kind of our word against theirs, and that was something that was quite difficult, was to sort of build credibility and show that, look, these stages are really important to be able to deliver this. For you actually be able to deliver this in a credible way.
Yeah, I think scaling a business is challenging, full stop, right? But if you add in the factors of, unknown territories, unknown client profiles, like who's your the ideal customer, don't really know, all that sort of stuff, and how do you actually deliver this stuff? Plus scaling a bit, like it takes balls, big balls.
There's a lot, and it's one of those things, naively you sort of sign up to it and go, yeah, that looks like good fun, and then you go, what have we done? Yeah, what have we done? There are so many unknowns in it, but you figure it out. That's the fun, isn't it?
Yeah. And did you find that that sort of excitement, did that start to dissipate as you get into these, you sort of go, okay, we've solved that problem. Then you turn another corner and you go, there is an equally big problem right here. Here we go again. Or was it like, oh, this is exciting because it's a completely different problem. I don't know how to do this. Let's work it out. Did that excitement dissipate because challenge after challenge is a bit of a grind?
I would be lying if I said that it didn't. Yeah, no, of course. And I think when I joined, the sort of real fascination was that we have a blank sheet of paper. Literally, sort of week one was go to the pet shop, buy a bag of insects, buy a cat litter tray to rear these things in, and a bag of dog food. It was like to feed them on. It was that kind of sort of rudimentary. We went to B&Q and we bought a whole bunch of boxes to sort of rear these things in. Very hands-on and literally just trying to get these things to survive and sort of figure out what they look like. And kind of week two was like, all right, let's get on a whiteboard, blank whiteboard. Let's sort of talk through all of these different processes that these insects need to go through. What's the biology here, and therefore what's the kind of engineering sort of processes, and what should each one of these look like? Cool. Let's try and now iterate from that. That was like endlessly fascinating because it was just a sort of a crazy engineering project, and we got the freedom to just play and design from first principles what this thing could look like. I think as the business matured, we'd solved a lot of those difficult sort of processes. We knew what the core technology looked like, and it was a case of iteration on that. And I think the sort of levels of responsibility and money just ratchets up over time. And I don't think you really realize it until you come away from that wow, how much of a load you end up carrying. And I think, yeah, towards the end, I think I was I'd sort of done a long 8-year stint, and I was feeling pretty shattered and pretty burnt out. But I think like it was really, really, really good experience for sure.
Any points along that journey where, because you talked earlier about the business in its infancy, and then every business goes through that kind of maturity cycle, processes have to be put in place, etc. Were there any points, and it sounds like you guys navigated that really well and fairly quickly, actually. Like from a lot of the time I'm speaking to founders, CEOs, etc., there's kind of an inflection point where things are starting to go wrong, and the focus that you were able to put to the business in the early days gets you to step one, but you have to then change and evolve, but they're not always ready to do that or able to do that. Was there a point in which you sort of felt like things are starting to break here? Was that a tied in with commercial milestones and growth, or was that a kind of size of the business time, 10 hires, 15 hires? At what point did you feel like maybe things started to break?
Yeah, absolutely we did. And it comes back to that sort of know what gear to be in, knowing how to think about this. So what kind of beast is this company you're creating? Is it sort of a group of close-knit people who are autonomous and can figure stuff out, and there's a few people you all get on really well, very flat structure, just move really quickly, through to now we've got a sizable team, we've got some money in the bank, we've got customers. It's an entirely different process. You need to think differently. I think probably the inflection point was the Series A. I think things were sort of creaking at the seams from an operational perspective. I think it was just still fairly chaotic, and I think that was partly the transition to me taking on the MD role, was to just fix a lot of those processes. And it was a sort of starting to become a bugbear of mine that I was not able to do my job as efficiently as I could do otherwise, because actually we need to just now build a finance department, or we need to build an operational department, or we need an HR team that can help to onboard staff and look after staff, all that kind of stuff. So that's why we sort of switched gears, and I stepped into that role. The first probably 3 to 6 months as my role as MD was to try and get processes in place. It was a very sort of ops heavy, and then it became much more sort of strategic and sort of about commercializing the business. But it was probably 3 to 6 months of just building some processes to make things work. And stuff did go wrong. Yeah, 100%. I think probably the worst week I've ever had, I think we call it Hell Week, was we just closed over $5 million. We were trying to sort of look to the future and scale. So we were sort of hiring, we were finalizing our strategy. We were so busy on so many different things. All the money had landed in a single account, and we had plans to sort of move this money around and, make sure it was safe. But it was, it was in a secure bank account. That was something that could wait a couple of months. It's in Silicon Valley Bank, and the whole thing went complete, like we were stuck. We were full on screwed. And so I got a call on Thursday night from founder saying there's all these rumors around Silicon Valley Bank's going to go under. And I'm like,
surely not.
And so he's like, well, look, maybe I should just move some money around to just make sure we're safe. Okay, fine, move some money around. Right, I've moved it around. Okay, fine. That was Thursday night. Start looking at, the news. I'm like, oh, okay, there are some sort of inklings here. Definitely move that money around. And the money was just stuck in the sort of pending outbound of the account, and hadn't left the account. And we're getting more and more nervous throughout the day. And then a whole bunch of news breaks, and the bank is in, basically collapse. We're getting calls from our lawyer, who obviously knows who we bank with, saying, listen, guys, this is like serious. I'm on call all weekend. Like, we're going to get through this together, kind of thing. It was sort of emergency meetings all weekend. Like, what an outrageous couple of days that was. So we kind of just cleared the decks, and we had these sort of strategy meetings to try and figure out how we're going to deal with this. And to the point where Kieran had signed a petition. There were a bunch of sort of CEOs in the London tech sector who'd written to government to say, look, you've got to you've got to do something about this. You've got to support your tech businesses. Nothing's going to come of this. But then I look at the news on BBC and Rishi Sunak's jumping on a plane to go to the States to go and sort of sort this out. The
Good
next
man.
thing I know, there's talks going on at the highest possible level. One of our funders were absolutely amazing, wrote to all their companies and said, listen, we've got your back, guys. You'll be able to make payroll by, for next month. Let us know if you're affected. There were sort of emergency contracts written over that weekend by lawyers that were signed, literally like whole
Wow.
contracts were just drafted where these sort of loans were put in place, temporary loans. I'd written this sort of statement to go into the employees knew nothing about it. So like Monday morning, I'm dressed up to go to work. I'd written the statement. The statement had changed about 3 or 4 times over the weekend as the news had sort of evolved. And basically it was like, look, we are in serious trouble. We've got this money to sort of get us through this next month's worth of payroll, but I don't know if we've got a business. I don't know if we're going to get this money back. That was virtually the statement I was about to make.
Gee.
And then I checked the news on Monday morning just before I go to work, and it's all good. HSBC have procured the bank. We're all safe. You'll be able to access your funds the next week. And that was it. We were fine. And like, what an absolute roller coaster that was. And I think, looking back over that, we sort of did a full on sort of debrief. Was that how could we have just made sure we didn't get into that situation? I think probably the first bit of advice I give to anyone who closes any sort of serious amounts of cash is just get your banking, your treasury policy in place, because that was a freak incident, whereas essentially it was a bank run. It wasn't like we were banking with a tiny sort of niche bank in the middle of nowhere. Like Silicon Valley Bank is a major bank in the US. So I don't think we did anything outrageously irresponsible.
No.
But that said, there were things that we could have done differently. And I think, make sure you've got a number of bank accounts, spread your money around, because for whatever reason, even if you can't access your funds for whatever reason, right? Like you're locked out of your bank account for a password issue or anything, to actually make sure you got funds in different accounts, I think is a really important one. But it went sort of deeper than that. So when we looked at the sort of the entire security of like our funds, from who do we bank with, and we went through sort of ranking different banks and sort of looking at their assets and security. And I guess probably the best bit of advice from one of our investors is just put your funds in JP Morgan Stanley, HSBC or Barclays. If any one of those go down, then you don't have to worry about your company. The whole world is absolutely screwed. So like, they are safe as houses, really. So that's what we did, and we had sort of bank accounts with each one of those guys. We also had US currency because we had a US topco and we had a UK subsidiary, so we had to do currency hedging, and that was something that we developed a strategy there for currency hedging. Then you've got a decent amount of cash on in your bank. Actually, is really important to make sure that's generating interest for you, because sizable chunks of interest there. So making sure you've got kind of 30-day, 60-day policies, and you're sort of bringing funds through as and when you need it. Like dual authentication on accounts, making sure that you've got like really clear sort of processes in place. All that stuff, when you hit kind of Series A territory, even if you absolutely trust everyone in the business 100%, which we did, you've just got to change your entire approach. It's no longer just a kind of group of mates trying to make something happen. This is a formalized business. You've got stakeholders, you've got investors. You need to be squeaky clean on all that stuff, so that if anything like that goes wrong, people will be asking questions, and you can say, look, well, here's our policy on this, and these are all of the things that we've implemented to make sure that we're safe. It was a big wake-up call, and it's a horrible week. And I think we were unlucky, but I think that has probably been one of those sort of lessons where if I were to do that again, day one when the money lands, like that's the first thing you do, is make sure that your cash is secure and like you've got those robust processes in place.
Yeah, because we were actually in my previous business, we were exposed to that as well. And it was as you say, sort of, we weren't quite at where you were, but it was a sort of mental few days. Then it was also mental how it was just HSB stepped in, it was all fine again so quickly. It's like, that was a weird blip. Did that actually happen? Because I genuinely thought because all of our clients were exposed to it as well. I was like, hang on a minute, not only are we potentially in trouble, but we also lost our client portfolio. So that's a double bubble. But it did just all of a sudden go, oh, no, don't worry about that. That's all sorted. So thanks to HSBC, praise the Lord. So let's get into a little bit more around some hiring sort of chatter around whilst you were scaling. So it sounds like your move to MD was actually a very pivotal point for the business in terms of processes and putting things that needed to happen, that sort of startup to scale up piece. So it almost sounds like that was probably the most important hire in a way. But with hindsight, was there a role that you just put off and hired too late? And now you think, do you know what, we should have got on top of that way quicker for these reasons?
Yes, I think so. Actually, it was our operations. We had a head of people and operations,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it was just part of that time where the sort of company was at that size where there were a whole bunch of. We just needed to sort the business out. It was in quite a chaotic stage. Inherited that role and did a lot of that work myself, but with hindsight, I think I should have got Martin in sooner. He was absolutely amazing. I think the value of bringing someone in to take away a lot of that kind of those processes and get all that stuff sorted gives you headspace to think strategically and to worry about the future strategy of the business, which is where the vast majority of my time should have been spent.
Yeah.
And I think I ended up absorbing far too much of, like, we used to call it the mud of just there's an NDA that needs signing, or there's this thing that's gone wrong, or there's something with payroll or whatever. It just absorbs your time. And I think that mud sort of floats to the top, because if you try and run a company in an organized way, you sort of assign clear responsibilities and roles to different people. And like, I always thought about it as spinning all these different plates. And, there's a clear plate, which is like clearly defined. Someone's spinning that, they've got that. There's one over here, there's one over here. But what happens is there's all this stuff that falls through the cracks, which is kind of not this person's job. It's kind of not this person's job. And therefore, it's sort of landed on my plate. And so I would just be it's very easy in that sort of leadership position to just be sorting all the sort of crap around the edges out and not actually thinking strategically. So Martin really helped with that. And it meant that he handled the kind of people side of the business. He handled the operational and the legal side of the business. And it meant that my time was freed up to think, where are we going? What's our strategy from a commercial perspective and from a technical perspective?
Classic founder, isn't it? It's the classic founder journey. You come in, you start something, and I listened to a podcast the other day that labeled it, "You're chief of effing everything." And you are.
Yeah.
You just do everything because you are the only person. But that investment in a salary, whilst it's a cost, it's a big cost, the value of it is untold in terms of being able to now actually focus on what you should be doing and why you started the business and where your skill set actually is. And then I guess on the other side of that coin then, so, was there a hire that you made that was turned out incredible, but when you were looking at it, it looked risky in terms of cost or where you were in your journey? Was it maybe the ability to attract that type of talent at the stage you were? Was there any sort of hires like that?
There was. It was actually our FD who turned out to be unbelievable, but he was just way overqualified for the job. And we were like, what's wrong? What skeletons does this guy have in his closet? Which means he sort of wants to come and work for little old Entocycle. So he previously ran a big investment fund. They built, a significant portion of the M25. They built wind farms. At one stage, there were sort of something like 20% of the UK's energy came from their facilities, and it was huge, like a huge like infrastructure business. And he was their FD. And so we're sort of going through these CVs for our FD role, and this guy just sort of stuck out like a sore thumb. And we spoke to him, and he was incredibly nice and very competent and interviewed really well. And we went, okay, so like, what's his salary expectation? Because it's probably an order of magnitude higher than what we want. And he was quite reasonable about that and whatever. And so it got to the point where I was like, I'm just going to have to take him for a beer and just ask him sort of straight up,
What's
like,
wrong with you?
what's the shit? And he sort of smiled and said, look, this is not about the money. Like, I think he got to a stage in his career where you need to worry about money. And he was just genuinely really excited about what it was that we were doing and saw it as the future. And thought this is going to be loads of fun and just wanted to do it from that perspective. And so, yeah, we sort of were very clear. Look, you're going to be the guy who's going to be doing payroll. You're going to be the guy who's going to be like on Excel, sort of, managing expenses. Like, are you okay with that? And he's like, yeah, like, this is fine. This is what I'm good with. And I think that was absolutely the best, like one of the best hires we made. And he sort of gave us access to capital sort of beyond our sort of wildest dreams, and sort of,
Wow.
could bring a whole different investor base in from that sort of infrastructure perspective, and just thought about what it was that we did in an entirely different way. So I've come from this sort of technology background and see it as a bunch of technology. He saw that as a sort of, well, we've done anaerobic digestion plants and we've done kind of various different sort of facilities. This is how you package this up from a financial perspective. And these are the sorts of investors you go to. And this is how you package this up for different sort of, as a different entity. It just made us see the business in an entirely different way. So it was one of the best decisions that we made. But yeah, it did feel like a bunch of skeletons in his closet, but I haven't found them yet. So good.
It's one of those absolute gold dust hires, but it's great when you hear those sorts of stories. And then I think the other thing that we always find is that, getting the right talent is critical all the time, right? But when you're a scaling small startup, whatever you are in that journey, getting hires wrong are savage in terms of commercial, emotions, the cost, the impact it's had on getting that person up to speed. It's so much more risky for the business. Did you have any, no names obviously, but were there any absolute bad hires that just really put you back? And how did that impact the business?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most emotionally draining parts of the role. Like it's really tough when those things don't work out, and there's nothing worse than sort of managing those conversations and kind of putting those things right. But you've got to do it, and it does have a huge cost on everything, where the business is going, whether it's commercially or technically. Like you just need people to be the right people for the role. And then from a sort of emotional perspective, it's really difficult when you're trying to manage those people, but then also it's kind of disruptive for the whole company as well, and everyone else can see it and is affected by it. So I mean, I'm sure we've had a few over the years. I think you've got to accept there's this sort of certain rate to that. I think a few things that we tried to do, like hire slowly, be really meticulous on the hiring process. We used to put people through, we used to invest a lot of time in that process and put people through, whether it was a technical team, they'd be put through a technical test. We'd see how they think. We kind of go really deep on references. We would sort of look at it from a whole bunch of different angles. We get other people in the team to interview that person to see how they sort of integrate and fit into the team. So we go as deep as we possibly could to mitigate that. And then when you do have one that's not quite working out, lesson from there is just act quickly and humanely and just get it done, as quickly as you possibly can. The longer you sort of let that linger, it just gets worse for everyone involved. So just get it done quickly. But yeah, it's a tough process and it sucks. It just sucks for everyone. It's not a nice thing to go through.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. It's painful, but accept it's happening and get on it. And that's best for everyone, because a bit of toxicity in the business as well at that stage can be spread like wildfire, and you can't have it when you're that small.
Exactly.
To shift gear a little bit, Matt, and look at things maybe with a commercial lens. Something I always find really fascinating is when you've got this founder, a lot of founder personalities are, I think, quite optimistic, opportunistic, full of energy, looking at things. I think you have to be, right? To make it through, as you said, it's a real roller coaster to make it through the ups and the downs. Kind of have to have that undying belief that things are going to work out. Something I've seen being really key, and I tend to see it coming later in a company's journey, is the ability to know when to sort of kill a project or kill a client, or take that hard decision to say, what, this isn't where we win.
Yeah.
But you've invested so much time by that point. Were there any, I guess, types of customer or specific pilots or deployments that just got really stuck or turned out to be a distraction, and you had to kind of make that very hard decision of saying, what, we've got to kill this?
Yeah. And it's tough because even if you're okay with it, there are, you've got to be conscious of the fact that there's a whole bunch of people that worked really hard on making this thing happen. and you're sort of pulling the rug from underneath them. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is, like as I said, we'd been a really tech heavy development for a long time, and then there was this sort of question of how do we commercialize the technology we've got, and there's various lenses through which you can look at that. So we could sell from an individual machine level, we could sell sort of a subset of a process, and we could sell an end-to-end facility. There's various different ways of sort of breaking up this process, and that sort of commercial model was developing over time. And one of them was we were trying out, okay, can we just sell? We had this machine which was absolutely phenomenal and was a sort of game changer in terms of our kind of ability to produce things efficiently. Can we just sell these machines to the industry? And this becomes like the ubiquitous machine in the industry. And whilst I guess it was a reasonable idea on the surface, I think it quickly became clear that the sort of size of that market was not all that big, and the number of customers that could integrate this machine in a way that would work for them just didn't really make sense. It didn't really work, and we had to sort of say, look, we're going to turn down the sort of deployment of this as a product. It's still absolutely it was integral to our whole facility, but we had to sort of knock the sort of commercial efforts on the head on that one. I think that was pretty difficult for the team that were affected by that. And we did a whole bunch of different projects, and yeah, some worked and some didn't. And you've got to do it. And I guess if you can create this culture across the business of, look, we are experimenting here, we are entering into the unknown, we are trying a whole bunch of different things out, and some will work and some won't, and that is absolutely healthy and a good thing. And we don't see if a product doesn't work out as this like huge failure or we've all messed up. This is exploration. You can build that culture across, then I think that helps to soften the blow. But nonetheless, I mean, it sucks when you've worked really hard on something and it hasn't worked out and you just sort of can it. It's quite a hard thing to go.
But like you say, I mean, if you're taking the learns from that and then you're taking that into moving forwards, then there's positives to be gained from it.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that can be critical or can be the differentiating factor between survival or not. I mean, it depends on the stakes, but sometimes I've seen companies really trying to make what ultimately should have been a distraction work, but whether that's sort of founder being blind or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
What would you do differently if you could do it all again now? And that's a really broad question, and I'll try, I think, deliberately leave it like that. So that could be, just putting that out there, looking back.
I mean, there's so many different ways of answering that question. I think we do one thing really, really well, as opposed to lots of things in a mediocre fashion. That's really hard for, like, even though we sort of accepted that as a mantra, it's really hard for us to do in an industry that didn't have an ecosystem of sort of partners and other technology. You couldn't just fit into this industry and go, we make this one machine and it's better than everyone else because it's great. Well, but what about the thing before that and the thing after that and all the rest of the, like, you're going to have to do it. So I think we were in a sort of tricky spot where we just had to do so much. And so maybe even if you sort of extract further back from that, make sure that the thing that you are doing can fit into an existing sort of infrastructure ecosystem, like sales process, whatever it is, so that you're not reinventing the wheel across everything. I think would have really helped us to scale. So you have a sort of high value niche product that fits into an existing industry. I think is a very sort of, from a commercial perspective, makes a huge amount of sense. I guess Entocycle was more than just a commercial perspective though. This was we're going to do something to try and make the world a better place, and we're going to go for it and go for that sort of vision. So it meant we kind of had to do a bit of everything. But I think what really helped us was then when we started to form strategic partnerships and we started to sort of break up, okay, well, you guys can do this half the factory, we can do this half the factory, let's go out and commercialize together as an entity, let's build a sales process together, let's sort of share our customers, let's build this, and sort of that really helped us, and that gave us a sort of doubled the size of our team overnight, effectively. So like work with strategic partners and start to divide things up so that you can focus on your thing, define your thing that is a USP, which gives you an unfair advantage, and be really, really good at that, as opposed to trying to do everything in a mediocre way.
Just on that last point there, Matt. So how do you, when you're using partners and they are an integral part of the overall project delivery, how do you then, on a sort of QA QC process almost? How do you still ensure that what they're doing is up to scratch and it doesn't sort of adversely impact what you're trying to do? Appreciate that there's obvious positives and benefits from that, but there's also some inherent risk there as well. Like, how did you manage that?
100%. So, I mean, that took probably 2 years to develop those partnerships, and we were like really careful on sort of that vetting process and making sure that there was the right fit from a technical perspective, from a commercial perspective, like a cultural perspective. I think we also tried to sort of punch above our weight as well. So we were working with like big multinationals. So the two major partnerships we signed was with a company called Bühler, which was a huge multinational sort of 13 billion Swiss franc turnover company, thousands of employees, 160 offices around the world, that kind of size of company. So the due diligence was much more, the focus was on Entocycle as opposed to Bühler in that relationship. So we had quite a lot of kicking the tires the other way. But I think it meant that we got access then to, these guys just build factories and had done for the last 160 years. So therefore we could sort of fall into that sort of process and of how they operated. They had a client base, they had all that kind of stuff. So I think that it was clear it was the right fit for us. And it meant that we sort of stepped up as opposed to having to sort of do too much due diligence on that side. And then the other partnership we signed was with Simmonds, again, like big multinational. So it meant that we had access to, suite of technology and their infrastructure and all that kind of stuff that came about it. So it meant that through signing those partnerships, we sort of got credibility quite quickly through that. So I think I would recommend it that way. I think the major risk there is that you get gobbled up in that as a sort of small company. You really got to sort of figure out, do you trust these guys? But then more than that, contractually, are you sort of protected? Is you protected? And sort of we went into that eyes wide open in terms of what are all the different ways that we could get screwed here, and how do we mitigate against that, and sort of make sure that was all part of the process.
Is that a deliberate choice to target larger companies to sort of mitigate that risk of working with like you described the relationship there? They were the big guys and they were sort of kicking your tires. Was it deliberate to go that way rather than one step down again, where that possibly might introduce more risk? Was that strategically, or did it just happen that way?
I don't think we set out to say what we need to do is sign two, major multinational partnerships with multinationals. I think it was, we need to talk to everyone across the industry and figure out who's doing what, and are there sort of synergies and relationships across that. It's true that it becomes quite clear that these guys are the ones that stand out because they can take us to the next level. These are step changes in terms of what it can do for our company. Whereas the other ones who were maybe smaller than ourselves felt like they introduced risk, felt like they kind of didn't give us access to a client base that we didn't already have. I guess it sort of fell out of that sort of filtering process, if you like.
Yeah. Last question on that, and I know you've got some questions to ask as well, Alex, but out of interest, what was the sort of onboarding cycle, sales cycle with that whole company? Because full disclosure, like we've seen massively in the recruitment industry of late, the sort of new client acquisition onboarding sales cycle is just lengthened like I've never seen before. Just, useful to get insight into how long that process sort of took.
Yeah. So like to get to a point where we signed a partnership deal and announced it in a press release, that was like probably at least 2 years of like relationship building. But that didn't mean that we weren't sort of gaining value from those relationships before that. So what we tried to do for both parties was to make a really big decision, like a public partnership announcement, a much smaller decision, right? So we ended up having kind of a memorandum of, well, it starts off as a relationship. You build, you can see them, you share technology and, kind of where you're trying to go, where they're trying to go, and build that sort of an exciting future that has the two of you involved, and sort of define what that looks like together. That's all sort of, I guess, stage one. Then we started to move towards a sort of MOU type relationship. So that was like, memorandum of understanding of this is how we could work together. There's kind of no contractuals in there. We can both walk away from it whenever we want, but we're committing to giving this thing a go, and we can both see why this is advantageous to us, and this is what we do, and this is what you do, and this is why this is greater than the sum of its parts. And then let's commit to reviewing that in 6 months' time to see where that goes. And those 6 months went really well. So, okay, great. How about we formalize this now? How about we, kind of do a press release and announce it, because then it's going to give us the next wave of kind of credibility. And that's kind of how we did it. So build it slowly over time.
You've touched on some really lovely sort of snippets of learnings, I guess. But one thing I'm always interested to sort of get to the bottom of is, if you were talking to a founder 12 months behind you, what would be the sort of narrative of, this is what you should or shouldn't do? Trust me. Is there one thing that you think, man, you need to know this? Or is it lots of different things that are maybe not quite as impactful, but still important?
I'd probably try and stray away from specific advice, because it's always a bit dangerous. I think probably like headspace and like your own mindset is probably the single most important thing that you can control. Your mindset is, no matter how chaotic and crazy it gets and all the highs and lows, your mindset is the single most important thing. And that's the thing that you can always control in those environments. So I think really trying to introduce like a, practice of looking after your own mindset and headspace, and having time to reflect on that and reflect on what's going well and what's not going well, how you're feeling, and really trying to stray away from burnout, because it's so easy to happen. I think I've suffered from it in the past. I think that's probably the kind of biggest bit of advice I would do. And then I guess all the specifics of how you run your company, like, you founders know what to do, but like, look after yourself, because it can get quite messy quite quickly.
Yeah, I think that's such good advice, because it is so easy to just get caught up and work all of the hours and do all of the jobs and do the weekends, and you just become absolutely encompassed in it, which is important, but you've got to have that mental ability and
So
sort of freshness almost, right?
yeah, there's did some work with a career coach who was previously a neuroscientist, and one of her sort of allegories was, you got kind of three. I'm going to do a terrible job in explaining this, but sort of 3 tiers of how your brain works. So you've got like your prefrontal cortex. That's where all of your sort of rational decision making happens. That's where your best thinking comes from. Then you've got your kind of monkey brain, which is much more sort of emotional. There's the chimp paradox, and
Yeah.
so where sort of your chimp comes in, and that's all about survival, and it's a much more sort of emotionally driven response to things. And then you've got your lizard brain, which is responsible for things like heartbeat and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of the energy levels that these guys, each one of those elements takes, if your prefrontal cortex would be the jet engine, but your chimp brain would be, a car, and then your lizard brain would be like a little scooter or whatever. So if you are burning out, if you're working all the hours of the sun, your jet engine just gets shut down. And so what you're operating on is this sort of chimp brain, because that's all you've got energy for. So you become really emotional, you become really bad at making decisions. And we've all seen it, right? When we're tired and exhausted, we make bad decisions. We end up getting snappy with, people around us. And it's like, that's not how you should be building a good company. Building a great company means you have a really fresh mind, you got a fresh perspective, you bring your best ideas to the table. That's where your original idea came from, was from that position of like creativity and fresh mindset. And you've got to look after that. You've got to harness that. I guess that's why bringing Martin, our sort of operational guy, in meant that a lot of that sort of workload got taken off my plate, and it meant that I could get more into that sort of creative strategic space, because there was just less volume of stuff to do, and it was more about being more creative and more strategic. So I think it's really important.
Not heard the jet engine to scooter analogy, but I really like it. It makes a lot of sense, actually.
Just on that, I mean, not necessarily off topic for the podcast, really, but just always interested in talking to people that have gone on that journey. Are there any sort of non-negotiables that you have for yourself now personally, having gone through that journey?
Good question. I don't want to work all the hours under the sun anymore. I don't think I'm doing my best work when I do that. I don't think I'm happiest when I do that. I have a daughter, I've got a family, like all that stuff is really important to me. And so like I'm I'm no longer your guy who wants to, work 24 hours a day. And I think having that balance and sort of perspective in life is actually really, really important. So yeah, and what I'm looking to do now is more of a sort of portfolio approach where, taking on sort of a 3 or 4 day a week job with one company and then working with a number of different companies in other places. And I think that will help to sort of feed that that's where your creativity comes out, because you're able to work with different ideas and different people and sort of different networks, and actually being able to sort of cross link all those different ideas together helps you to sort of see around corners and sort of make better decisions. I think fewer hours is one of them. And having some hard caps on that, and also working with multiple projects is really interesting to me as well.
You read the 4-Hour Work Week?
I have, a long time ago.
Yeah, also. Okay.
Like, kind of hated it when I read it. I'd be interested to read it again. I kind of hated it because it seemed to come from the perspective of, look, you want to do the minimum amount of work you possibly can, like basically figure out how to sort of get away with doing the least possible. And that, I guess that's not what I'm saying. I enjoy working. I want to do really good quality work, but to do really good quality work means that you should be in your like prefrontal cortex. You should be using that jet engine. You should have downtime. Exactly. And I think that's
with yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's probably the sort of, that's what I'm trying to achieve.
Very randomly, I'm actually reading the 4-Hour Working Week at the moment, which I don't know, I've actually spoken to you about that, but I agree with you, Matt. And I find some of the things like the guidance to getting more time from home, I'm like, it's a bit conniving. The way you're achieving that, I'm not really sure flies anymore, because you're basically getting people to be a bit dishonest and calculated. I get the outcome, but I was a bit like, I'm not sure you should do it that way. But I share your sentiment on that.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a question that we always ask on this podcast, but I don't know, it may not be as relevant because you've obviously mentioned at the start that your journey with Entocycle's come to an end. But just to loop back, I guess it'll close the loop on Entocycle. What sort of capability or function do you think would become critical for them in the next, so looking forwards now in the next sort of 12 to 18 months? Because you've had your infancy period, you've done your Series A, you've formalized, you've got processes, and they've become like a real company in inverted commas. What's next? What do you think then is needed, if you're able to comment on that?
Yeah, so I kind of think we've probably almost like had that conversation and made that transition. So I decided that after 8 years it was time to go and do something else, and I was sort of excited to go to the next challenge. But I think as a company it was a great time to leave, because the vast majority of the sort of technical side of the business, developing what this factory is going to look like, is done. The thing works and it's great. It's now about commercializing the business, and has been for a couple of years. And so as the sort of technology development side of it is starting to ramp down, the commercial side has been ramping up over time. We've made that conscious decision to actually switch the leadership role from a sort of technical background, which is my background, to a commercial background. So our CCO stepped up to the MD, or now the CEO role, and is leading the business. So I think that's the best possible thing for the business. He sees the world in a different way to me, and will take the business to the next level, because it's now all about the commercials. It's now all about finding the right customers, scaling the business, and thinking about it in a sort of different way. Again, it's about knowing what gear to be in, and it feels like the right time to be able to make that transition and really sort of step up on the commercial side.
Yeah, makes perfect sense, and is the transition you would expect it to take. That's been really, really interesting, fascinating. Thank you for your time. I mean, we've obviously run over, as we always do, but that's a good thing in my view. So yeah, look, thanks again. Really good to talk to you, and speak to you soon.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Will.